Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Craig Wallace, and I'm the Acting Chief Executive Officer of Advocacy for Inclusion. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Canberrans, and that we respect their elders, past and present. AFI thanks the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people for their ongoing custodianship for the land, mountains, and rivers of Canberra. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today to reflect on 10 years of our National Disability Insurance Scheme, which was first rolled out in some significant ways here in the ACT. We've got a pretty good set of speakers to help us reflect and gaze forward today, and these include Nicole Lee, Charlotte Bailey, Sean Fitzgerald, Dr. Andrew Lee, and Alicia Payne. We thank them all for being part of this. And while they can't be here with us in person, Minister Bill Shorten and ACT Minister Davidson have also taken the time to send messages and reflections for us, and we thank them too. The introduction of the NDIS marked a turning point for people with disability across Australia. Today, over 500,000 Australians rely upon NDIS for support, including over 9,000 Canberrans. The 15th of May 2023, today, marks exactly 10 years since historic legislation was introduced into the Federal Parliament, part funding the NDIS through an increase in the Medicare levy. It also marks around a decade since the NDIS was announced as a whole of jurisdiction trial site here in the ACT. These were the moments, perhaps, when we locked it in and sealed the deal. There was no going back then, and there is no going back now. This didn't happen by accident, but by campaigning and collaborations between people with disability, officials and activists, carers and providers here in the ACT, and politicians as well. There isn't time to name them all, but we do owe a lot to people like Sue Salthouse, Natalie Howson, Dougie Hurd, Lois Ford, Louise Bannister, Graham Hambleton, Stephen Fox, Justin Ray, Kate Starrick, Rex O'Rourke, Amanda Charles and her colleagues, and former ACT Chief Minister and now Senator Katie Gallagher for the ACT. A bit later, we'll hear from Sean Fitzgerald, who, along with PWD-ACT members David and Jenny Heggendorf and people like Dennis Stabak, were instrumental in early work and thinking around individualised funding, long before the NDIS was conceived, and then those people were part of NDIS campaigns. It is not true that disability rights campaigners were a cog in a big service provider campaign. We were there long before anyone had heard of NDIS, and the ACT arrived to the party early. There have been a lot of discussions lately around what needs to be fixed with the NDIS. Today is something different. It's an opportunity to reflect on what we have achieved, what we hoped for, and how it delivered, and also what we might want the NDIS to look at on the 15th of May 2033, when we're all hopefully still around and taking part in a webinar like this. It's perhaps a moment to remind ourselves, why did we do this? We're imagining this ambitiously as a kind of birthday card to the scheme. Our report on that, in that light, will be a scrapbook with your reflections, memories, aspirations and hopes. Hopefully we'll open this on the 20th birthday of the scheme and find that it's come of age with our best hopes realised. We've reached out to people involved in the early days of the scheme to share their thoughts, and we will be dropping some of these into chat as we move forward. We also invite you to contribute your own reflections in this webinar. Look, I'm delighted to hand you over now to Emmy Groves as our MC this afternoon. A proud South Australian, now living in Canberra. I think really a proud Canberran now, Emmy. Emmy Groves has spent 8 years covering ACT politics for Win, prior to taking up a multimedia reporter position with ABC Canberra in April 2022. Emmy's been a really generous part of AFI forums over the last 12 months and has connected with our issues in a great and important way. And we appreciate the fantastic skills, warmth and generosity she brings to our public events. Thanks so much for being part of today, and over to you, Emmy.
Thanks very much, Craig, and thank you to Priscilla, our interpreter. Really pleased to be part of today. And for those of you who don't know, Craig was he led the NDIS funding campaign to get it funded through the Medicare levy and also accesses vital support as a participant. So just a wonderful man to know and an advocate. So really glad that he's put this together today, and I'm sure you will all agree. And as Bill Shorten said at the National Press Club last month, Australians know that the NDIS is as fundamental to our social democracy as things like Medicare, fair pay and superannuation. But as Craig alluded to, how can it reach its potential and deliver the outcomes that Australians and Canberrans with disabilities need and expect? So hopefully some reflection on achievements and looking at some possible answers in the future today. So I'll begin with some housekeeping, of course. This is a webinar, so your microphone and video are turned off. If it's not, please do that now. But we do invite you to engage via the chat function. Share your own reflections on the last decade. What is the NDIS? How did it start for you? What does it mean for you? And what do you want from it in coming years? The AFI team are gathering these together, and they're going to form part of the memory book, looking back on the decade. We are recording today's forum and we'll be using images in AFI's policy and advocacy. So if you do have any concerns, please let the team know as soon as you can. And if you're engaging on social media about it, the hashtag is NDIS10. So please use that. We're going to be hearing from the ministers with their messages first. Today is a chance to hear from not just them, although we'll give them plenty of airtime, but participants, advocates, activists, and of course those ACT parliamentarians on how the NDIS has affected them and the people they represent and what they hope for the future. First, though, we're going to hear messages from Bill Shorten, the Federal Minister for the NDIS and Government Services, and ACT's Minister for Disability, Emma Davidson. Our first message from Mr. Shorten will be delivered on his behalf by Dr. Andrew Lee, who is the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury and the Federal Member for FENA in the Territory. Dr. Lee.
Well, thanks so much, Emmy. Thank you, Craig, for putting this together. We're meeting on Ngunnawal land, so let me start by acknowledging their elders. Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawal Wadi, Dara Wadi, Dindi, Wangaralin Jin. I want to acknowledge any Indigenous people present in today's webinar. And just to pay tribute to you, Craig, for putting this event together. I've got a 10-year-old child, and to mark his birthday and think about what he'll do over the next decade reminds me of where the NDIS has come from and what it might yet become. So let me now read Bill Shorten's message. Thanks for the chance to send this message on the 10th anniversary of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. When the ACT NDIS trial began on 30 September 2014, its first quarterly report recorded 103 participants. By the end of last year, that number had grown to almost 10,000 participants. Advocacy for inclusion has been there for the journey, and I applaud your commitment to empowering people with disability in the Canberra region. The Albanese government has also made its commitment to Australians with disability clear through our federal budget. The message was, the NDIS is here to stay. After 9 years of drift under coalition governments, $910 million over 4 years is the first step to getting the NDIS back on track to improve the outcomes and safety of participants. It will allow us to lift the capability of the NDIA, to invest in more informed decision-making processes and specialist training of planners. We'll move to less frequent plan reviews where it makes sense, reassuring participants that it will not affect future plans if they do not spend their budget. And the crackdown on fraud and waste will continue so that every dollar meant for an NDIS participant gets to the NDIS participant. All the budget measures point towards one goal: better participant outcomes. If Australians with disability get the right supports and the right services, it sets them on the path to greater independence and the ordinary life they aspire to. The Albanese government will restore the NDIS to its original intent. And people with disability will be by our side as we embark on a co-design program that will amplify the voice of people with lived experience. We recognise costs to the NDIS will rise, but it will remain demand-driven, and growth will be sustainable so future generations can benefit from the scheme. Meaningful reforms recommended by the NDIS review will help us achieve that result. I'm going to be working hard for Australians with disability, and I know Craig and the team at Advocacy for Inclusion will keep fighting the good fight. Congratulations to all you've accomplished together, and thank you for joining with me to build a stronger NDIS. Bill Shorten, Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Thank you, Emmy. I look forward to returning in my capacity as the member for Fenner, alongside my terrific colleague, Alicia Payne, who's joined today's conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lee / Minister Bill Shorten. And now we're going to hear a message from Minister for Disability in the ACT Government, Minister Emma Davidson.
Dawara Nuna, Dawara Ngunnawal. This is Ngunnawal country. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded. I know many people and families have a connection to lands of the ACT and region. Canberra has always been a place where people come together to share knowledge and ideas. To become a truly reconciled nation, to be able to truly care for country and for each other, we must listen to, understand and support First Nations people. This is why truth, treaty and voice is so important, and it's why I will be supporting a referendum for an Indigenous voice to Parliament, as well as the work of truth-telling and treaties. I pay my respects to First Nations elders past and present and acknowledge them for their nurturing of future leaders, and I acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to reflect on what the NDIS has meant to me over the past decade, as well as for the people I know and represent in my role as ACT Minister for Disability. 10 years ago, the NDIS was introduced as a visionary and transformative scheme that would revolutionise the way disability services were delivered in Australia. It was an ambitious plan that aimed to give people with disability greater choice and control over their lives and to ensure they had access to the support they needed to live their best lives. Everyone has a right to independence, self-determination, choice and freedom from discrimination in their lives. That's what our NDIS is for. It's a demand-driven service with the ability to change lives. The NDIS has provided people with disability greater access to services and supports, including healthcare, assistive technology and home modifications. It has also helped to break down barriers to employment and education and to promote greater social inclusion and community participation. The NDIS has not only transformed the lives of people with disability, but it has also created new jobs and opportunities for those working in the disability sector. The NDIS has stimulated economic growth and development, creating new markets for disability services and providing a significant boost to the economy in every community where people with disability can now access the services they need. The NDIS is also part of the ongoing transformation of the way we think about disability, from a medical model to a social model that focuses on empowering people with disability to lead independent and fulfilling lives. And it's time to take the next step in how we think about disability. For people with disability to take pride in the beautiful diversity of ways that our bodies and minds work, and to celebrate the strengths that come with their perspective and experiences of the world. As we celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the NDIS and reflect upon the successes of the scheme to date, it's also important to acknowledge that it has been a bumpy road to get where we are today, and there is still a lot of work to be done. I was working in the community sector when the ACT joined the NDIS, and I saw firsthand how hard the impacts were from this change in funding structures. Service providers and advocacy organisations, especially NGOs and disabled people's organisations, were under immense pressure to fit into a funding model that was about delivering units of service and didn't allow for the planned coordination, individual or systemic advocacy or professional development that we know would really make the NDIS shine. People with disability continue to face ongoing challenges, including discrimination and social isolation. We know there's lots of work needed to improve service delivery for people within the NDIS and a desperate need to expand service capacity to better support the needs of neurodiverse people and those with ADHD, just to name a couple. I'm hopeful that the NDIS review, being chaired by Professor Bruce Bonahady and Lisa Paul, will bring more lived experience and expertise into co-designing a better NDIS for the future. I know that the review co-chairs are committed to that, and I will continue to advocate strongly for your voices to be heard and your experiences to be brought to the decision-making table at every opportunity. I'd also like to make a few comments surrounding the Commonwealth budget, which was handed down last week. The National Cabinet decision to circumnavigate the NDIS review and draw an arbitrary cost target, halving the projected growth in NDIS investment, was disgraceful. I do not support this decision as the ACT Minister for Disability, and I'll do everything I can to stop these restrictive targets from blocking access to the services you need. I would encourage you all to get in contact with my office to share any thoughts you may have on the Commonwealth budget so that I can best represent your voices in my engagement with the federal government. Looking to the future, I hope that in a decade, the NDIS will become embedded in Australian health and social services in the same way that Medicare or public education are just part of what we do in Australia. That when we say we are a place where everyone has the opportunity to live a good life, that includes people with disability, and that the NDIS recognises the intersectionality of disability with cultural background, our First Nations people, with gender and sexuality, and in fact better recognises that all people with disability do have sexuality as part of their identity, and with every life stage from early childhood through to people over 65 years old. As we celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the NDIS, I think it's important to remember the profound impact this scheme has had on the lives of so many Australians living with disability. I look forward to continuing to work alongside you to build a more inclusive and accessible society where everyone has the opportunity to live their best life.
We are pleased to have Nicole Lee as our first speaker today. Nicole's a dedicated voice for disabled women and abuse survivors and a determined campaigner for the prevention of violence against women. This includes advocating for safer mental health and recovery pathways for women with mental illness and trauma. She's studying a Masters of Social Work at La Trobe University and is currently the president of People with Disability Australia. And Nicole, I'd like to invite you to now tell us what the NDIS has meant for people with disability around the country and perhaps some hopes and aspirations for the next decade.
Hi, thank you everyone for inviting me here today. So I just want to acknowledge that I am currently meeting with you all on the lands of the Wurundjeri Willem people down here in Victoria and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging as well. So I guess, what are some of the things that for the NDIS has meant for people with disability across the nation has been a huge shift in the way we think about our services and supports and a huge shift in the way in which we live our lives. So if I can give you some, I'm sure everybody in this room understands this, but just for the politicians in the room and those who are, being allies on our side and whenever we, sort of have to go in and remind people of what the NDIS means, the NDIS has meant a huge shift from things like, on the old scheme before we got one shower a week. We didn't get to choose who was the one that was showering us. We didn't get to choose on what day that shower would actually happen. And, and it could be a different person every week coming in to shower you. Now, I know personally there's only so many people I want to be naked in front of. But what the NDIS has actually meant, us having choice and control in saying what days you want to have a shower, having the dignity of being able to have more than one shower a week, You got a maximum of 3 showers per week, but only if you're incontinent. So every second day, you can imagine, we lived a life of living in our own mess. The NDIS has meant we don't live like that anymore. It has given us dignity over our lives. It has given us, respect within our own homes, within our own, personal hygiene, having clean sheets on beds, all of those sorts of things, without having to constantly feel grateful as to whether or not, your worker actually turned up that week. That's what the NDIS has meant for us. It's meant from us going from block funding for, things like wheelchairs, cobbling together, say, $1,200 worth of funding to build an entire new chair that possibly cost $5,000. When you're on a disability pension, you could never afford that gap payment. The NDIS has meant we can actually access what we need when we need it without fear of how are we going to actually cover the gap? How are we going to, do this? And how are we going to prevent ourselves from being injured because we've had to deal with, shoddy broken equipment because we couldn't afford that gap funding? This has been a massive investment in our lives. Like, not saying that they've got it correct. I'm not saying that the NDIS has got everything right and they're kicking goals left, right and centre. There's certainly a hell of a lot more that needs to be done. There's certainly a hell of a lot more that needs to change. But what it has meant, it has meant a big shift from where we were before and the system that we lived on before. If I think of my aspirations and everything for the future, is to really strengthen that element of choice and control, strengthen the ways in which we can access our services and supports, and to really, really build within the system. I know there's been a lot, they talked about it a lot, but it's not something that has actually happened in principle as well as what people would have liked, is around supported decision-making capacity, independent decision-making capacity. A lot of the time we're sat in a room and said, what do you want? Without actually understanding, for so many of us, for so long, we've not been allowed to make choices for ourselves. We lived lives where everybody made choices, where we were just the passive one in the room, where other people made decisions. And what that has actually meant for us has been, we've gone into this system without people understanding that we still actually don't know how to make choices for ourselves. We haven't been enabled to make choices or been given that capacity of a life where we could build to make choices. I come a lot from the women, the feminist sector, and I listen to all the women talking in that sector, and their whole lives, they just assumed that they were going to go on to university, that they were going to have these pathways in their lives. For people with disability, that wasn't part of our reality. We never at any point, I never at any point thought that I was ever going to go to university, that I was going to be anything other than a low-paid worker in a full-time job, say, stacking a shelf at a supermarket. The level of expectation on me in my life was so low that I listen to these women talk and I don't see myself reflected in their lives. That's what the NDIS needs to be there to do, is part of changing that, enabling us to build our capacity, to have independence, to be just like all the other people around us that have dreams of aspiring to politics or aspiring to get into social policy in government, or aspiring to work in retail, wherever it is that they want to be, actually not feeling that they're boxed into what they can do, that they can have dreams and aspirations that are up there in the sky to aim towards, which we in the past had never been encouraged to do. So one of the things with the NDIS that needs to be done better is, how do we support people to rebuild that capacity in people? How do we build people up to make decisions for themselves? How are we supporting somebody to have an informed yet independent choice from the people around them? I don't think the NDIS is doing enough at this point in time to work with individuals who are experiencing domestic and family violence in their own homes, and that is a personal issue with me. The NDIS still does not have a gendered lens, unfortunately, but in the long list of things that need to be fixed, I think that's sort of down on the priorities at this point in time. But it is something that needs to be thought of, and how do they go about looking at what is the interpersonal safety of people on the NDIS. They will do risk assessments around what is the financial safety of the NDIS from participants, but not actually having, sort of personal, relaxed conversations with people who are coming in and they're doing plan reviews with, around, what is their interpersonal safety looking like? Are they safe at home? And not necessarily saying safe because that means falls risk. Is anybody making you feel scared at home? And having those conversations with us and working with us and their staff actually knowing, well, what are pathways to support that person? And that is something that is lacking within the NDIS at this point in time. But I'm hopeful, as things mature, as we get things back on track with new stewardship at the helm, that these are the conversations that we will be able to have with these people who are now in charge, since the change of leadership with the NDIS moving forward. People with NDIS, people on the NDIS have, the housing insecurity is something that is quite prevalent. And my deputy CEO the other day said to me, with their NDIS review process, there's that, to see somebody when asking, what is the NDIS meant for you? And people responding with, the NDIS is meant for me, staying alive. That is really poignant. That is a poignant comment in that, we're not out living glorious lives. We're not out living the high life on the NDIS. The NDIS for people has meant the difference between living and not living, being able to survive on their own and being able to live a life versus potentially, not living to the age that they are, not getting the support they need to keep themselves healthy and well and alive. That's like, there's nothing more confronting and poignant to see that, to really remind us why the NDIS is important, why we need to ensure the principles of the NDIS, demand-driven, choice of control, remains at the centre of absolutely everything that they do. And us as a community will rally around ensuring that that is what remains at the centre of it, because this is the difference between life and death for a lot of people. For parents with disability, with children, the NDIS can mean the difference between remaining an involved and competent, an involved parent in their children's lives versus losing their children to the system because they don't have the supports to do what they need to do as a parent. That, they can be involved. Just some of us need supports to be able to have that involvement. So, it's such a vital scheme, and it does have a long way to go, but it has actually done a hell of a lot in the meantime to shift the landscape of what we lived on before to what we're living on now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nicole. Really appreciate it. And I did just want to remind people that there have been a few comments and responses and thoughts in the chat. Please keep adding them, that they are really important, and this is a vital conversation. There's more than, or I'd say almost 55 participants now, so it's great to keep this conversation going. Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Lee, who we heard from before. Dr. Lee is the member for Fenner. And Dr. Lee, just before I get to the prepared question, the NDIS, as we know, is meant to be a joint endeavour, but the ACT Minister Emma Davidson had some pretty strong words to say just before. Did you want to respond to those first?
Thanks so much, Emmy. Look, I think the main focus of this conversation should be on the participants, and I think Nicole's comments there were just extraordinarily powerful, where she talked about the NDIS as being a matter of survival for many participants, and also of the basic question of dignity. I don't imagine any of my constituents would think that it was okay not to be able to choose the person who comes in and showers you and the days on which you get showered. So I thought that was a really valuable way of crystallising what the NDIS has brought to the community, and how it has not only benefited people with disability and their carers, but also strengthened us as a society, because ultimately we're weaker when any one of us isn't properly looked after. Nicole talked about the importance of a gender lens, and that's something that I know has been important to Bill Shorten, making sure that we're getting that variety of perspectives, and also for people who are non-binary, making sure that those perspectives are brought in as well. Additionally, Bill has been very concerned about making sure that the NDIA's board reflects the lived experience of people with disability. Having Kurt Fernley as the chair, having half of the participants as people with disability does ensure that the scheme has that lived experience reflected. The review process that we're going through is very much about making sure that the NDIS stays on track. We want to maintain the demand-driven process. We want to ensure that the NDIS serves the people that it was designed to serve, but we have to ensure that the sharks and shonks are kept out because that simply undermines money going to people who need it, as well as risking eroding community support for the scheme. I remember being a member of Parliament when the NDIS first came through. It's one of those reforms where you really do have that sense of being part of something that you know is going to change Australia. I remember Bill Shorten talking about it as adding another pillar to the social safety net. You know, you've got the pension and unemployment insurance and Medicare, and then Bill said, you put in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So it's a scheme which we are very proud of as Labor members and strongly committed to it continuing. I know Alicia, having served extensively on the Parliamentary Oversight Committee and worked very closely with Bill Shorten, has an even stronger perspective than me in terms of the needs of the NDIS as it evolves for the next decade. But from my perspective as a local MP, just thank you to Advocacy for Inclusion, to Nicole and to other participants on the conversation for highlighting what the NDIS means and also for continuing to engage in that conversation about what it can become.
And Dr. Lee, what are your hopes and aspirations for the NDIS by 2033?
I wanted to remain a system which is serving people with disability and their carers, to be one which maintains strong support across the community. Now, I think the story I talked before about building another pillar of the social safety net, in some cases, those pillars immediately get bipartisan support. So no one looked to take away the old age pension. But in other cases, they don't. And Emmy, you know the story of Medicare. From 1969 to 1993, every Australian election was a Medicare election in which it was fought over whether we kept or scrapped Medicare. I don't ever want Australia to have an NDIS election in which one party is saying, let's scrap or massively scale back the NDIS. So that public support is absolutely vital to the scheme, getting the integrity around it and making sure that it's continuing to evolve as the workforce and technology moves.
Absolutely. And just finally for you, Dr. Lee, I mean, you touched on it before, but this social reform, what does it really mean to Australians and perhaps particularly to, you know, the members of your electorate and Canberrans who, you know, were that trial site and really kind of kicked it off?
We really were there at the start, weren't we, Emmy? And that's not only tribute to the government of the time, the Gillard government, for choosing the ACT as being the first full jurisdiction launch site, but also to those advocates without whom it wouldn't have happened. You know, I think particularly as we're having this conversation of Sue Salthouse and the energy and ideas that she brought to that discussion, having people like Sue, like Craig at the table saying to the rest of Australia, the ACT is ready to go as a trial site. Let's crack on with this. The conversation we constantly had back in that period from 2010 to 2013 was advocates saying we can't afford to wait years and years. You know, this scheme is not going to be perfect when it launches. We've just got to get it going because the position right now is untenable. So I'm very proud of it, but I'm sure it's going to continue to evolve and grow, and Canberrans, as usual, will play a disproportionate role in improving the NDIS as we did with building it the first time.
Sensational. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Lee. And I did just want to follow some Dr. Lee's comments with just some just really powerful stuff that we're getting in the chat. Sue says, I wouldn't have survived the past year without the NDIS. I wouldn't have survived. I mean, this is just incredible. With deteriorating disability and my main informal carer no longer able to support me day to day, I'm so grateful to the NDIS. She got in the scheme in 2020. Getting in was harder than doing my PhD, and reviews are stressful, but it's given me lots of tools and support to live a decent life. I've never accessed Centrelink or any disability services before, so I can't compare, but I am so thankful. And just one more from Tanya, the NDIS has given my sister-in-law the ability to live in her own home, to have a life outside of the locked dementia ward of an aged care facility. She doesn't have dementia. In the last 2.5 years, she's been able to see what Canberra looks like now after being institutionalised for almost 30 years. She now has a life, going out for lunches and dinners, going to the movies, bowling, going to the circus. And most importantly, Tanya says she has a voice. She can now make decisions for herself, and we as her family are now able to enjoy time with her as a family. And that was, I guess, a little bit of what Nicole said earlier about the importance of that independent decision-making capacity. So, yeah, please join in and add your thoughts on the NDIS, whether you've experienced it, what you think of it, and let's keep that chat going. It is now my pleasure to introduce Charlotte Bailey. Charlotte comes to us with a great resume and lots to say about the NDIS and her life. She's employed in the office of the ACT Down Syndrome Association and is a Down Syndrome Australia Employment Ambassador and Disability Advocate. She was a winner of last year's Chief Minister's Inclusion Awards as an emerging young leader, and was a runner-up for 2022 ACT Young Citizen of the Year. Charlotte, that is a sparkling resume, sensational. Charlotte, can you tell me what are some of the things that are important in your life?
My family is important to me, and my friends are important to me as well. Learning independence and building my confidence in my work and my connection to the community are important. I want to do all of the things that my siblings can do. I want to be able to enjoy life like everyone should.
Absolutely. Charlotte, can you tell me how the NDIS has helped you, lead a good life or a better life?
All of the skills I have learned from having access to the NDIS have helped me to gain meaningful employment. It has also helped me build skills in participating in the community and in sports and life skill programs, and also social connections. Without the NDIS funding, I would not have been able to do any of the things I have done. Both of my parents work full-time, and I have 3 other siblings. They would not have been able to help me to access all the programs or training I have over the years. My mum always says that she is so grateful that the NDIS was created because it helped me to be an active member of our community and live a full life.
Absolutely. Well said, Charlotte. And just finally, Charlotte, what are your hopes for your life and the support that you receive perhaps in the next 10 years?
I have learned so much and had so many experiences since I have been on the NDIS plan. I hope I get to continue to learn new skills, to build my confidence to meet new people, and build my network of friends and community connections. I have lots to learn. With the help of the NDIS, I know I can achieve all my goals. It might take a while, but I'll get there. I just want to live my best life and to be healthy and always stay happy, and I want that for everyone.
Absolutely. That's really, what the NDIS is about, and it's wonderful to hear that and hear what the NDIS has done for you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Charlotte. Really appreciate it. I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Alicia Payne, who is the federal member for Canberra. She served in the Parliament since her election in May 2019. Alicia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emmy, and thank you very much, Craig and Advocacy for Inclusion, for organising this today. It's a real honour to be with you to mark this really important milestone of 10 years of the NDIS today. And I just want to also begin by paying my respects to the elders of the lands on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri, well, the lands which I'm on today in Canberra, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. The NDIS, it's been wonderful to hear from previous speakers, Nicole and Charlotte, about the positives of the NDIS, and it has been a game changer for many people with disabilities' lives over the last 10 years. And I want to again acknowledge and congratulate all of the advocates in the disability community who fought for this for many, many years before it happened, but also over the last decade have fought for it to deliver on its original promises of choice and control for people with disability. And it's wonderful to see my colleague Andrew Lee here, who's spoken in his own right and on behalf of Bill Shorten, and they've talked about our budget, which has put in the single greatest funding injection into the NDIS since it was created. So I won't go over some of those changes, but I've had the privilege to be on the parliamentary committee on the NDIS in both terms of parliament. So that's given me the opportunity to talk with people with disability, as well as providers and others, stakeholders in the scheme all around the country over the 4 years that I've been in Parliament, and again this time. And as well as being a local member, many of my constituents who are participants in the NDIS have talked to me about their stories. And so it's wonderful to hear the really positive stories where the NDIS has changed people's lives for the better. And of course, that was always the intent of the NDIS and why so many people fought for it for so long. But I guess as someone on that committee and as a local member, I do tend to hear more of the negative experiences with the NDIS where it has not delivered what was promised. And so I really, when I say, I acknowledge the advocates for really staying the course on the NDIS, to on that committee see people front up time and time again and share these stories. Now, at the risk of sounding a bit political, it was Labor that introduced the NDIS, but for most of its life so far, we have had a coalition government until recently. And while the NDIS has had bipartisan support, I would say that their heart has not been in it the way that Labor's is, and the way that it has been implemented has not always been the best. So I'm really pleased to see the policy changes that Bill Shorten has already led since being elected just not quite a year ago now into the government. But honestly, I feel that the biggest change and the most important change is the fact that our government believes in this and gets that it is about choice and control. Gets that the point was to let people with disability live their best lives, and it's getting back on track with that now. And I was privileged early on to go with Bill to meet with the staff at the NDIA when he visited Canberra soon after becoming minister, and to hear him speak with them about how he wanted to work with them and use their ideas and make the NDIS the best thing it could be. And looking around the room, I could see the public servants really moved and inspired that this was a real change. And we've seen change in the leadership of the NDIA. And as Andrew mentioned, Kurt Fernley as the chair, and having more lived experience on that board is really central to that. But I really want to, as I say, thank the advocates and the people who fought over so many years for this, because I want to see it be the best it can be. In terms of where would I want to see the NDIS and the future of it, it is really that, as Bill has said, putting the participant back at the centre of the scheme where they belong, And as he said, it's here to stay. And as long as the participant is at the centre, it is a sustainable scheme. That is the best way for it to work. In terms of where I would like to see it go, so it's more of that strengthening of choice and control, but it's also seeing what was also one of the original intents of the NDIS was to see innovative responses in the market to the supports that people with disability need and want, to enable it. When we have that choice and control, we will see, more things become. We still see some limitations, I suppose, in the market where people can't actually get the things that they need, or in a way that is, that can be delivered sort of effectively. So seeing that grow is something that I really hope we see in future years. And just another issue where I see, some of the most heartbreaking, frankly, stories with the NDIS is around disability accommodation. And many people that we have, like constituents of mine, but others we've heard from the committee, who want to be able to live with their families and have appropriate accommodation, accessible accommodation, and the supports that they need, and why that is so difficult. I don't understand, because that is obviously one of the want to see the NDIS delivering. And I know that this is something that Bill is also really concerned about and getting that happening. So yes, but a great milestone today, and onwards and upwards.
Thanks very much, Alicia. And just on your last point, I remember talking to Craig, I think it was just after the ACT budget, but he was saying that for Canberrans with a disability, there isn't this was back in October, but there probably still isn't a single housing property for rent that was affordable to somebody on the disability support pension.
Yep. Yes, it is an issue in Canberra. We do have high rents, and yes, as the social security system is something that's really important to me, and something that plays a really important role in helping people to helping Australia to be an inclusive and egalitarian society. So that is a really important part of the puzzle as well. But also it's about the accessible accommodation being built. At the moment, one of the only providers, one of the only people who are actually building accessible accommodation is the government, the ACT government, for public housing, which is fantastic. But there are also people on the NDIS who are not eligible for public housing because they work, but they also need to be able to find accessible accommodation, which is currently unaffordable. So that is a nut that we need to crack.
Absolutely, and you mentioned, strengthening choice and control and getting back to the original intent. And I remember, talking about questions on the NDIS's efficiency, future sustainability. I mean, I was hearing people were having trouble getting approval for something like a shower chair, which only costs a couple of $100, but there were so many extra steps and assessments that, would just take so long and cost a whole lot more than that. So I guess, when you mentioned things like, limitations in the market, this is about getting down to those real tangible benefits and things. And I guess earlier than 2033, I mean, these are things that your government is working towards pretty soon.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to get right, and the other part of that we are addressing, is moving towards more flexible and transparent planning processes. And all along, this has been a problem, like the fact that people couldn't see draft plans, couldn't see a draft of their plan, and then having reviews after review that were, needing probably a simple change and needing to go through a massive review that puts a lot of strain and stress on people. That's a really important part of it. And people with disability are the best judge of what's best for them, and they want what's an efficient use of their planning budget as well. So there are many examples where I've heard where people have been denied something because it costs too much, but it would actually save a lot in another area and enable them to live a more independent life in another area as well. So it's about really listening, putting that participant at the centre, listening to them, and I think the rest will fall into place when we do that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alicia. And just some kudos from Tanya in the chat. Thank you, Alicia. Keep up the great work.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for your time. Our final guest speaker is Sean Fitzgerald. Sean will be well known to many of you through his long history of advocacy for the NDIS, but also efforts to trial and establish individualised funding and self-management of disability support funding in Canberra. His work included being part of early work on consumers in control in Canberra in the early 2000s, and then consultation and reference groups for the NDIS. Sean, what was it like to be in that early work towards individualised funding in the ACT? What did it mean for you?
It was exciting. It was outright exciting. It was around making the most of the money that you got from the ACT government. And the ACT government employed me to look into it and came up with a system that under ACT legislation worked. There was to be a small organisation set up, a proprietary limited organisation, with a board and an ex-minister for disability service in the ACT, Bill Wood, gracefully said that he would be the chair. And we set up a system of accounting and working out where people with a disability could have more direct control over their funding and could choose their own support staff rather than what was normal for them, have an agency, Dane, who was going to work with you. But the freeing up extra funding meant that people could actually get more value, more hours worth of support for the money they had. And in the end, we ended up switching to and piggybacking on the back of a New South Wales organisation, not for profit, that did exactly the same thing. So those of us that really were keen, I think there were about 10 participants that were really keen to get it moving and change their lives, took up with them, and we continued on until the NDIS came in.
Incredible. And Sean, I know you were at the launch of the ACT as that first whole of jurisdiction trial site with 5,000 consumers. From there, and then, looking at Australia transition to the scheme and work to use information tech to improve participants' interactions to where we are now, are we where we're meant to be?
No. I mean, personally, I am, but then I've had some, because I've been involved with the NDIS from the very beginning and was on a couple of reference groups setting up how individualised funding would look, but also more importantly, the assistive technology reference group. I had high-level contact with that, puts me at an advantage, which unfortunately other people didn't have. So I ended up after doing a couple of plans and plan reviews with NDIS appointed planners, I ended up getting a permanent planner. And I've sort of pointed out to Bill Shorten recently that this has been a huge success in my life. Also, longer paying periods, my current plan has been for 2 years, and it relieves that stress of going through an annual review for a situation that won't change. Spinal cord injuries are a stable disability. They don't change. What I need is a sort of CPI increase in funding every year. But because the planner knows me very well, it's been very easy to do and a much more comfortable transition plan to plan. Over the last, I think I've had the same planner for now for 4 years or 5 years. It's been a much easier situation. And when so many other people seem to have such a hard time and get that stressful time every year going through a plan, having to justify their life again and again and again.
And Sean, I know you worked on early projects like Nadia where co-design was attempted, how could they do real co-design now?
I think that one of the key successes out of Nadia, apart from being recognised by IBM and Microsoft at the top levels as being the most innovative AI project going on in the world, and how, I mean, to quote Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft International, quoted the Nadia project and what we were doing as a co-design group as changing the way that IT is going to be done in the future. Full stop, all of it. I think the key issue that came up was co-design. So I was brought in at a ground level when ideas were being kicked around well before people started tapping keys and punching out code, to see what was possible. So being fairly imaginative, I gave them all sorts of ideas, and very quickly we put together a reference group, which I was chair of, that stretched across people from across the country with good ideas, and we developed from there. And our close-knit experiences and input with the IBM folks at IBM, the folks at the NDIA IT department, and Face Me at from New Zealand, doing the graphics side of things, was essential for them, and they all described their experience of working with a reference group or a sort of co-design group as being the standout thing for them, and they all said how much they learned out of it. I mean, simple things that programmers wouldn't necessarily normally think of. I remember talking to Nadia, the Nadia testbed, and I realised very quickly she didn't understand normal pleases, thank yous, normal conversation, normal little quips that we all use. And talking to a device like that, she very quickly slip into normal conversation as though she's a real person. And I went back to the programmers and said to them, can we get, she doesn't understand thank you, she doesn't understand please, these normal polite phrases she doesn't understand. And they looked up at me with an astonished look on their face because they'd never thought of it. They're programmers. That's not the way they think. So having that co-design aspect added a very human part of interaction to what Nadia was.
Absolutely. And just finally, Sean, what are your hopes for the future?
What I hope for the future for the NDIS is longer plan periods. As I said, what worked for me, and I think would work very well for others, would be a more direct and long-term relationship with planners. So the same planner year in, year out. And obviously an ability to change between planners if you're not getting on. But I think for me, what's worked for me is in terms of self-determination, having the ability to self-manage. But not only that, as I've advocated for, I think the most important thing would be to have people who have not had the fortune to be in business like me and understand numbers and finance, but to have proper training, one-on-one training or class type training on how to do that so that they understand how to use Microsoft Excel, for instance, and how to read financial spreadsheets, how to deal with organisations to get the goods and services that they need to operate their lives, how to be able to do some negotiation to get the best deal for them, best deal for the scheme. And I think if the NDIA make sure that these things come into place, not only will more people be able to self-manage, but they'll be able to self-manage more successfully, have a more satisfying time with the scheme. But in doing so, that saves the scheme money. And it also saves everybody concerned a lot of angst. And I see far too much of that in the scheme so far.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean. Really appreciate you sharing your story and your thoughts. And yeah, hopefully it is a brighter future for the NDIS and building on the achievements and things that have come before. I'm going to hand back over to Craig Wallace now for closing remarks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emmy, and thanks to everyone who was part of the panel today for sharing so much with us, and also for our parliamentarians for being part of this and carving time out of what we know is kind of a busy schedule that you've got at post-budget week. I'd like to particularly thank, again, Emmy. Like, part of what advocates have been on over the past sort of 10 years is a journey that's involved educating the media at times on disability issues, and also on the need for an NDIS and individualised funding. And I feel like we've come on a journey together, like over talking about some tricky issues that have highlighted a lot of need, and that's been really, really welcomed in the housing space, in the COVID space, and with income support, and now the NDIS. These events do not happen through me just clicking a screen and turning on a button. They are very much a team effort involving a lot of difficult wrangling in the weeks leading up to it and on the day. And so it's been at this event with some close calls, but quick saves because of the talented staff team that we've got at AFI. So I particularly want to thank Carla, Izzy, Roz, Joe, who's our research and data person that feeds into this, and to acknowledge the leadership of our CEO, Nick Lula, who's on a bit of leave at the moment. Look, just in terms of summing today up, look, we should never forget in all of the discussion about NDI's sustainability and where we are now and what needs to be fixed, why we did this. This is bigger than the politics. It's bigger than sometimes than the politics of our own sector. This scheme could easily have died when I look back at the last 10 to 13 years at any number of points following the change of government, all of the inquiries and reviews and media stories on it blowing out. It could have easily gone, not just because of a change of government, but because of changes of appetite, some genuine issues that we've had within the agency, clashes between the bureaucracy and the agency. Like, we all know that there have been points where this has been a tricky and rocky road. One reason that that didn't happen was that people with disability, and I don't just mean people like me, advocates and activists who are in the media all the time, but ordinary people and families whose lives are in a lot of difficulty, stumped up day after day, week after week, and year after year. You fronted up inquiry after inquiry, sharing deeply personal stuff. Like, I don't imagine that any of us really want to talk about the number of showers that we've had, or difficulties going to the toilet, or even finding housing in a city like Canberra can be a sort of shameful thing. Like, we kind of expect that everybody's living a kind of good, settled public sector life. So I say thank you to all of the people with disabilities and families. We've seen some of those people here today, but there are many, many thousands of you who have stumped up day after day to share your intimate, personal lives in the defence of what is a social good and a piece of social security infrastructure that just needs to be there for us. It's a bulwark against unexpected events in the same way that Medicare needs to be there for us, that the defence budget needs to be there for us in case we have a changing national security climate. The NDIS is our protection against a disability, which is one fall, one car accident, one accident of genetics away from us all. Look, again, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for attending. Thanks, Andrew, for stepping into Bill Shorten. I think you did that well. You didn't need the computer morphing, but thank you very much for doing that. We have some work going forward. We are part of a process to provide feedback into the NDIS review, and we're doing some work on that going forward. We've got some emerging partnerships, including with the Commonwealth and with national peaks like WIDA, to do some of that work, and I'd acknowledge that here as well. Please keep in touch and read our fortnightly e-news to keep in touch with that work. Share your stories. We know that some people wanted to today, but haven't within the shape of the webinar, but please do that and you'll be part of the report going forward. So thank you very much for being part of this event. We'll be posting the recording online so that people can access it, and have a lovely rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Craig.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Craig.
Bye.